Hold on. Jesus had a brother who rose to become the leader of the entire early Christian church. Most people have never even heard of James the Just, and yet he held more influence over early Christianity than nearly any other apostle. While Peter and Paul received most of the spotlight, it was Jesus' own flesh and blood brother who carried the keys to the church in Jerusalem for decades. But here's the part that will stun you. James didn't actually believe Jesus was the Messiah while he was alive. So what dramatic moment turned a doubting brother into the most powerful church leader of his generation? And why did people call him the Just? Today, we're unfolding the complete untold account of the man who shaped Christianity from behind the scenes. But before we get into it, think about giving this video a like and subscribing if you haven't yet. Your support allows us to keep producing these deeply researched videos that help you learn something new or simply pass the time. Also, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. We're building a worldwide community here. So, without any further delay, shall we begin? The Skeptic of Nazareth. In the small village of Nazareth, nestled into the hills of Galilee, a family lived with a secret that would alter the course of the world. Among them was a boy named James, growing up in the shadow of his older brother, Jesus. The carpenter's home seemed ordinary in many respects. Children ran through dusty streets, bread baked in clay ovens. Life followed the rhythm of seasons and Sabbaths, but nothing about this family was actually ordinary. James observed his brother through the eyes of someone who knew him far too well. He had seen Jesus as a child, scraped knees and all. He had shared meals with him, listened to him laugh, watched him shape wood beside their father, Joseph. When you grow up next to someone, you see them without the filter that strangers get to enjoy. You know their routines, their moods, the way they chew their food. So when Jesus began speaking of his mission, when crowds began forming and rumors started circulating, James did not rush toward belief. How could he? This was the very same brother who had grown up in the same household under the same roof. The Gospel of Mark records a revealing moment. Jesus had started his public ministry, drawing crowds so massive that his family became worried. Mark writes that they went out to seize him because people were saying, "He is out of his mind." Stop and think about that for a second. His own family believed he had lost his grip on reality. They were not hostile enemies or religious rivals. They were people who loved him, who feared for him, who wanted to bring him home before he caused more trouble or harmed himself. James was one of them. The Gospel of John spells this out even more directly. When Jesus attended the Feast of Tabernacles, his brothers approached him with words edged in doubt. "Leave here and head to Judea so your disciples can witness the works you are performing," they told him. But their tone carried a sharpness. They were challenging him, pressing him to prove himself if he was truly so certain of his claims. Then John adds a line that slices through any confusion. For not even his brothers believed in him. Not even his brothers believed. James heard the teachings. He saw the gathering crowds. He knew about the rising tension with the religious authorities. But belief demands more than evidence. It requires a leap that James simply could not yet take. His skepticism was not rooted in malice. It grew out of familiarity. Jesus was his brother. How could his brother possibly be the Messiah, the Anointed One, the very hope of their people? This doubt was not unique to James. Throughout the Gospels, we see a recurring pattern. Those nearest to Jesus often had the hardest time accepting who he claimed to be. The people of Nazareth turned him away, asking, "Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James and Joses and Judas and Simon?" They took offense at him. Familiarity bred not faith, but contempt. James lived in this tension. He loved his brother, yet he could not follow him. As Jesus' ministry continued, the gap only widened. Jesus spoke with an authority that disturbed the religious leaders. He performed signs that drew in thousands. He claimed a relationship with God that struck many ears as bordering on blasphemy. And through all of it, James stayed on the outside, watching with a mixture of concern and unbelief. The family dynamic must have been painful. Picture the conversations, the arguments, the long stretches of silence. Mary, their mother, held things within her heart that she could not fully put into words. She knew things about Jesus' birth that the others did not. But James had no angel visitation, no miraculous conception to anchor his faith. He had only what he could observe and touch and reason through. And what his reasoning produced led him away from belief. This skepticism would make what came next all the more astonishing, because the James who doubted would become the James who led. The brother who could not bring himself to believe would become known as James the Just, a pillar of the early church, a man whose righteousness became legendary. But that transformation demanded something dramatic. It required an event so powerful, so undeniable, that it would shatter every doubt James had carefully constructed. For now, though, James remained in Nazareth. He stayed within his skepticism. He remained in the shadow of a brother he loved but could not follow. The carpenter's son, who claimed to be the Messiah, continued his journey toward Jerusalem. And James, the skeptic of Nazareth, waited in the wings of history, completely unaware that his entire world was about to collapse and be rebuilt in a single impossible instant. The turning point, witness to the resurrection. The news arrived in Nazareth like a thunderclap. Jesus had been arrested. He had been put on trial. He had been executed by crucifixion just outside the walls of Jerusalem. For James, the emotions must have been crushing, grief over a brother lost, vindication, perhaps, that his skepticism had been justified, relief that the dangerous mission had finally come to an end, guilt for having doubted, for having kept his distance, for not being present at the end. Crucifixion was Rome's cruelest form of punishment. It was designed not only to end a life, but to humiliate, to turn suffering into a public spectacle. Jesus died as a criminal, hung between two thieves, mocked by those passing by. Whatever messianic hopes his followers had carried died with him on that cross. The movement was over. The family could return to ordinary life, or so it appeared. 3 days later, everything shifted. The Apostle Paul, writing to the Corinthians decades after the events, preserves a remarkable detail. He lists the appearances of the risen Jesus, the witnesses who saw him alive after his death. Paul mentions Peter, then the 12, then more than 500 brothers all at once. But then he adds something specific. Then he appeared to James. Then he appeared to James. Not to a crowd, not to the disciples as a group, to James specifically, personally. The resurrected Jesus sought out his skeptical brother and revealed himself to him. Paul gives no further details about this encounter. He does not describe what was said, or where it took place, or how long it lasted. But the very fact that it is mentioned tells us everything. This appearance was significant enough to be remembered, to be passed down, to be folded into the earliest Christian tradition about the resurrection. What happened in that moment? What did James see? What did Jesus say to the brother who had doubted him, who had once thought him mad, who had stayed away throughout the ministry? We can only picture the scene. Perhaps James was alone, wrestling with grief and confusion. Perhaps he was sitting with family, trying to make sense of reports that the tomb stood empty. Then Jesus appeared, not as a ghost or a vision, but solid, real, still bearing the marks of crucifixion, yet alive in open defiance of death itself. The psychological weight of this would have been staggering. Every assumption James had held about the world shattered in a single instant. Death was final. Everyone knew that. Bodies stayed dead. Criminals executed by Rome did not walk again. Yet here was Jesus, speaking to him, looking at him, proving beyond any doubt that something impossible had happened. But it went beyond that. This appearance carried a message. Jesus could have appeared to anyone. He could have devoted himself entirely to his disciples, to those who had already believed. Instead, he came to James. He came to the one who had doubted. He came to family. This was an act of reconciliation, of invitation, of love that reached past James's earlier rejection. In that very moment, James's skepticism collapsed. The brother who had appeared to be insane was revealed as the Messiah. The mission that had looked foolish was vindicated. The claims that had sounded like blasphemy were proven true. Jesus had not been out of his mind. He had been exactly who he said he was. The transformation was instant and complete. James did not gradually arrive at belief. He did not need time to think it through or weigh the evidence. He saw the risen Jesus, and in that seeing, he became a believer. The skeptic became a follower. The doubter became devoted. Paul's simple statement carries tremendous weight. Then he appeared to James. Those 5 words explain everything that follows. They explain how a skeptical brother became a leader of the church. They explain the radical shift in James's life. They explain his future authority and influence. Because James was not just a believer, he was a witness. He had seen the resurrected Lord with his own eyes. This encounter transformed not only James's beliefs, but the entire trajectory of his life. He did not go back to carpentry in Nazareth. He did not fade into the background. Instead, he traveled to Jerusalem and joined the community of believers gathering there. The brother who had kept his distance throughout the ministry now stepped forward into leadership. The skeptic, who had once doubted, became one of the most trusted voices in the early church. Years later, when Paul wrote to the Galatians, he would describe James as one of the pillars of the church in Jerusalem, alongside Peter and John. But that standing did not flow from family ties alone. It came from this moment. It came from the resurrection appearance. It came from the fact that James had been chosen by the risen Jesus to be a witness, to be transformed, to be carried from doubt into faith. The turning point was not gradual. It was sudden, dramatic, beyond denial. One moment James was a skeptic, grieving a brother. The next he was a believer proclaiming a Messiah. The appearance to James stands as one of the most significant conversion stories in early Christianity. Because if Jesus could persuade James, the brother who knew him best and doubted him most, then the resurrection had to be real. And James would spend the remainder of his life working out the implications of that reality. The rise of a pillar in Jerusalem. Jerusalem, after Pentecost, was a city completely changed. The followers of Jesus, once scattered and afraid, now gathered openly. They shared meals together, prayed in groups, and proclaimed that the crucified Jesus had risen from the dead. The book of Acts describes these early days with a tone of wonder. Thousands came to believe. Signs and wonders took place. The community shared everything in common, making sure no one was left in need. Into this extraordinary moment stepped James. He was no longer the skeptic from Nazareth. He was now a witness to the resurrection, a brother of the Lord, a man whose transformation carried significant weight. The early believers welcomed him not only as family, but as someone whose journey from doubt to faith embodied the very power of the resurrection. If Jesus could convince his own brother, the reasoning went, then surely his claims must be true. But James did not just join the movement, he began to lead it. The transition was gradual but steady. Peter initially held the central role among the apostles. He preached the first sermon at Pentecost. He performed healings. He spoke with an authority earned through years of walking with Jesus during the ministry. But as the movement expanded, as the church in Jerusalem grew larger, the need for stable, grounded leadership became unmistakable. James offered that leadership. His personality matched the task. Where Peter was impulsive and bold, James was measured and careful. Where Paul would later push past boundaries and challenge traditions, James held firmly to the Jewish roots of the faith. He understood the law. He honored the temple. He maintained the practices that had defined Jewish identity for centuries. This made him trusted by the Jerusalem community, which was still mostly Jewish, and still figuring out what it meant to follow a Messiah who had fulfilled the law while remaining within it. Paul himself, writing to the Galatians, acknowledges James's status. He describes traveling to Jerusalem and meeting with James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars. The metaphor is striking. Pillars hold buildings up. They give structure and support. They bear weight. James, Peter, and John were the pillars holding up the early church during its most fragile formative years. But James's reputation went well beyond organizational skill. He became known for his deep piety. Early church historians, drawing from traditions passed down by those who knew him, describe James as a man of extraordinary devotion. According to Hegesippus, a 2nd century Christian writer, James prayed so often in the temple that his knees became calloused like a camel's. He abstained from wine and meat. He never cut his hair, following practices linked with a Nazirite vow. He wore only linen, refusing the softer garments others might choose. These details come from later tradition rather than from the biblical texts, so we should hold them carefully, but they point to something genuine. James earned the title the Just, not through self-promotion, but through consistent, visible righteousness. The Jewish community in Jerusalem, including those who did not follow Jesus, respected him. He was one of them. He honored their traditions. He lived by the standards they valued. This reputation gave James a unique kind of authority. When disputes arose, people listened to him. When questions needed resolution, they sought his counsel. When the movement faced challenges, he provided steady guidance. He became, in practical terms, the leader of the Jerusalem church. The book of Acts hints at this role. When Peter miraculously escaped from prison, he told those gathered to tell James and the brothers what had taken place. The wording matters. James is named first and separately, suggesting his unique standing. Later, when the Jerusalem Council convened to address the controversy over Gentile believers and the law, it was James who issued the final ruling, not Peter, who had been first among the apostles. Not Paul, who was the most dynamic missionary. James. His leadership was not built on charisma or bold proclamation. It rested on wisdom, steadiness, and a deep respect for the tradition out of which Christianity had emerged. The believers in Jerusalem needed someone who could navigate the tension between their Jewish identity and their faith in Jesus as Messiah. James embodied that balance. He also functioned as a bridge. The early church was being pulled in different directions. Some believers, like Paul, saw the gospel as fundamentally tearing down barriers between Jew and Gentile. Others felt that following Jesus required fully embracing the law of Moses, including circumcision and dietary restrictions. James stood in the middle. He kept his own observance of the law, while recognizing that Gentile believers might have a different path. This position was not always easy. Paul's letters hint at the tensions. In Galatians, Paul describes confronting Peter in Antioch because Peter had stopped eating with Gentile believers after certain men came from James. That phrase suggests that James's influence carried enough weight to cause Peter to change his behavior. Whether James intended this effect is unclear, but it reveals his central role in the ongoing debates shaping the early church. Through all of this, James remained rooted in Jerusalem. Unlike the other apostles, who eventually scattered to spread the gospel into distant regions, James stayed put. He was the constant, the anchor, the one who maintained continuity with the original community. His presence ensured that the church in Jerusalem remained the symbolic and practical center of the movement, at least for a time. The rise of James from skeptic to pillar is one of the great transformation stories of early Christianity. He did not seek power. He did not campaign for leadership. But his righteousness, his wisdom, and his unique position as the brother of Jesus elevated him into a role of tremendous influence. He became the man others looked to for guidance, the pillar holding up the church in its most critical city. And he was just getting started. The Jerusalem Council, the decisive leader. The crisis came to a boiling point in Antioch. The church there was flourishing, a lively mix of Jewish and Gentile believers worshipping together. But then, teachers arrived from Judea carrying a troubling message. Unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. This teaching struck at the very heart of the gospel that Paul and Barnabas had been preaching. It threatened to split the movement into separate camps, Jew and Gentile, each with different requirements for salvation. The dispute was not minor. It touched on fundamental questions. What did it actually mean to follow Jesus? Was faith in him enough, or did believers also need to fully embrace the law of Moses? Were Gentiles being welcomed into a Jewish movement, or was something entirely new being born? The stakes were enormous. Get the answer wrong, and the church would shatter beyond repair. Paul and Barnabas argued fiercely with these teachers, but the dispute could not be resolved locally. The question was too important, the implications too far-reaching. So the church in Antioch made a decision. They would send Paul and Barnabas, along with others, to Jerusalem. They would lay the issue before the apostles and elders. They would seek a definitive answer from those who had personally known Jesus. And so the Jerusalem Council was convened, probably around 49 or 50 AD. It was a gathering of the movement's leaders, a moment that would decide the future of Christianity. The book of Acts describes the scene. Much debate took place. Opinions were strong on every side. The Pharisees, who had come to believe in Jesus, insisted that Gentiles must be circumcised and required to keep the law of Moses. Paul and Barnabas recounted the signs and wonders God had performed among the Gentiles through their ministry, evidence that God was accepting these believers without requiring circumcision. Peter spoke. He reminded the assembly of his own experience with Cornelius, the Gentile centurion whom God had accepted through faith alone, granting him the Holy Spirit just as he had given it to the Jewish believers. Peter argued that requiring the law would place a yoke on Gentile believers that even the Jews themselves had struggled to bear. Why test God by burdening these new believers? The room fell silent. Then James spoke. "Brothers, listen to me," he began. His voice carried authority. He was not just another voice in the debate. He was James the Just, the brother of the Lord, the pillar of the Jerusalem church. What he said would matter. He acknowledged Peter's testimony, pointing out that God had shown his intention to take from the Gentiles a people for his name. Then James did something remarkable. He quoted the prophets, specifically Amos, demonstrating that the inclusion of the Gentiles was not a departure from God's plan, but a fulfillment of it. "After this, I will return, and I will rebuild the tent of David that has fallen." The prophet had written, "Its ruins I will rebuild, and I will restore it, that the remnant of mankind may seek the Lord, and all the Gentiles who are called by my name." James was making a theological argument. The Gentiles coming to faith were not outsiders being grafted onto a Jewish movement. They were part of the plan from the very beginning, foretold in Scripture. God himself was welcoming them. Then came James's ruling. "Therefore, my judgment is that we should not trouble those of the Gentiles who turn to God." He did not require circumcision. He did not demand full observance of the Mosaic law. But he did suggest something. He proposed that the Gentile believers abstain from 4 things: food polluted by idols, sexual immorality, meat from strangled animals, and blood. This compromise was brilliant. It did not load Gentile believers down with the full weight of the law, but it did ask them to respect certain practices that would allow Jewish and Gentile believers to share fellowship together. The restrictions were minimal, practical, and grounded in basic principles that had existed even before Moses in God's commands to Noah. James's judgment won the day. The assembly agreed. They drafted a letter to be sent to the Gentile believers, explaining the decision and affirming that no greater burden would be laid on them beyond these necessary things. Paul and Barnabas would carry this letter back to Antioch, along with representatives from Jerusalem who could personally confirm the decision. The Jerusalem Council marked a turning point. It could have gone very differently. If James had sided with the Pharisees who believed in requiring circumcision and full observance of the law, Christianity might have remained a Jewish sect. It might never have spread beyond the borders of Judea and Galilee. It might have withered as a small, insular movement. But James ruled otherwise. He recognized that God was doing something new. He saw that faith in Jesus, not adherence to the law, was the true requirement for salvation. And he found a way to affirm this truth while still honoring the sensitivities of Jewish believers who were struggling with the rapid pace of change. His leadership in this moment cannot be overstated. He listened to all sides. He grounded his decision in Scripture. He balanced theological truth with pastoral wisdom. He delivered a ruling that allowed the movement to expand while preserving unity. This was not the work of a fiery preacher or a bold evangelist. This was the work of a wise leader who understood that the future of the faith hung in the balance. Paul would later write about this council in his letter to the Galatians, describing how the pillars in Jerusalem, James, Peter, and John, gave him and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, agreeing that they should go to the Gentiles, while the Jerusalem leaders focused on the circumcised. But even in Paul's account, James's role stands at the center. He is mentioned first among the pillars, a subtle yet significant detail. The decree from Jerusalem spread through the churches. Gentile believers rejoiced at the freedom they had been given. Jewish believers appreciated the concessions made to allow continued fellowship. The church kept growing, expanding into new regions, reaching new peoples. And James, the decisive leader who made it all possible, returned to his work in Jerusalem, continuing to guide the mother church with the same wisdom and righteousness that had earned him the title, the Just. The skeptic of Nazareth had become the leader who saved the movement from fracturing. The brother who once doubted had made the ruling that allowed the gospel to reach the world. The voice of practical faith, the Epistle of James. Somewhere during his leadership in Jerusalem, James wrote a letter. It was not addressed to a single church or a single individual, but to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, a broad audience of Jewish believers scattered across the known world. This letter, preserved in the New Testament as the Epistle of James, reveals the heart and mind of the man who led the early church. From its opening lines, James's voice stands out as distinct. He does not dive into deep theological explanations or expand on the nature of Christ. Instead, he writes like a wisdom teacher, like a Jewish sage, offering practical guidance for living a faithful life. His concerns are concrete. How do believers handle trials? How do they treat the poor? How do they control their speech? How do they show genuine faith? The letter has a different feel from Paul's writings. Paul explores the theology of salvation, the relationship between faith and law, the mystery of Christ revealed. James assumes these theological foundations and then asks a different question. So what? If you claim to have faith, how does it actually show? What difference does it make in your everyday life? His most famous passage cuts straight to the heart of this concern. What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? James poses a scenario. A brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking daily food. Someone says to them, "Go in peace, be warmed and filled," but does nothing to help them. What good is that? Faith, James argues, if it does not produce works, is dead. This teaching has sparked debate for centuries. On the surface, it appears to contradict Paul's emphasis on salvation by faith, apart from works of the law. Reformers like Martin Luther struggled with the Epistle of James, with Luther famously calling it an epistle of straw because he felt it undermined the doctrine of justification by faith alone. But James is not contradicting Paul. He is addressing a different problem. Paul fought against the idea that people could earn salvation by keeping the law. James fights against the idea that faith is merely intellectual assent, a belief system that demands nothing of the believer. Both men agree that faith is essential, but James insists that real faith, living faith, produces action. It transforms behavior. It leads to love expressed in tangible ways. He illustrates this with examples from Scripture. Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. But that faith was demonstrated when he offered his son Isaac on the altar. His faith and his works worked together. Faith was completed by works. Even Rahab, the prostitute who hid the spies in Jericho, was justified by her works. Her faith led her to act, and that action saved her and her family. James's point is not that works earn salvation. His point is that genuine faith cannot stay passive. It must express itself. Faith without works is like a body without breath. It has the appearance of life, but no actual life within it. Beyond this central theme, James addresses a range of practical issues. He warns against favoritism, urging believers not to honor the rich while looking down on the poor. He speaks at length about the power of the tongue, comparing it to a small rudder steering a large ship or a tiny spark that sets a forest ablaze. Words carry the power to build up or destroy. Mastering speech is a sign of spiritual maturity. He offers guidance on prayer, encouraging believers to ask God for wisdom, to pray in faith without doubting. He warns against worldliness and the craving for pleasure that leads to conflict. He calls on believers to submit to God, resist the devil, draw near to God, and humble themselves. His instructions are direct, clear, practical. The letter also reveals James's deep concern for the poor and the oppressed. He condemns the rich who hoard wealth and exploit workers. He warns that their riches will rot and their gold corrode, and that the cries of the laborers they have cheated have reached the ears of the Lord. This echoes the prophetic tradition of ancient times, where prophets like Amos and Micah denounced injustice and called for righteousness. James's epistle reads like a collection of sermons or teachings he likely delivered in Jerusalem. It reflects his role as a leader who cared about how believers actually lived, not just what they believed. He was a pastor concerned with the spiritual health of his flock, addressing real problems they faced. Envy, slander, arrogance, neglect of the poor, shallow faith that made no real difference in the world. The style of the letter is also distinctly Jewish. It draws on wisdom literature, resembling the book of Proverbs in its form and content. It echoes Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in multiple places. James writes as someone steeped in the Hebrew Scriptures, someone who sees the teachings of Jesus as a continuation and fulfillment of the law and the prophets. Some scholars debate whether James himself wrote this letter or whether it was composed by a later follower in his name. The Greek is polished, which seems surprising for a man from rural Galilee. But others point out that Jerusalem was a cosmopolitan city, that James lived there for decades, and that he likely had help in composing the letter. What matters is that the tradition consistently attributes this epistle to James, and its content fits what we know of his character and concerns. The letter of James stands as his voice reaching across the centuries. It shows us a man who cared deeply about justice, about integrity, about faith that transforms. He was not interested in empty words or meaningless rituals. He wanted believers to live in a way that reflected the reality of their faith. He wanted rich and poor to be treated equally. He wanted speech to be truthful and kind. He wanted trials to produce perseverance and maturity. In many ways, the epistle is a portrait of James himself. Tradition tells us he lived simply, prayed constantly, and devoted himself to righteousness. His letter calls others to that same standard. It is not enough to claim faith. That faith must reveal itself in love, in generosity, in controlled speech, in patient endurance. Faith without works is dead, but faith that produces works is alive, powerful, transformative. James the Just wrote, "Just as he lived, with practical wisdom and a deep commitment to righteousness." His epistle remains a challenge and an encouragement to believers who seek not merely to believe, but to live out their faith in every moment of every day. The man of prayer and piety. The portrait of James, preserved by early church historians, extends beyond his leadership and teaching. It paints him as a man of extreme devotion, someone whose personal holiness set him apart even among the early believers. These accounts come primarily from Hegesippus, a Christian writer of the 2nd century, who gathered traditions about the apostles and the early church leaders. While these details are not found in the New Testament itself, they reflect the memory of James, held by those closest to the events. According to Hegesippus, James was holy from birth. He drank no wine or strong drink, he ate no meat, no razor ever touched his head. He did not anoint himself with oil. He did not use public baths. These practices align with the Nazirite vow described in the law of Moses, a vow of separation and dedication to God. Whether James formally took such a vow or simply lived in a way that resembled it, the tradition emphasizes his ascetic lifestyle. But the most striking detail concerns his life of prayer. James was said to enter the temple so often to pray that his knees became calloused and hard like a camel's knees. He spent hours kneeling on the stone floors, interceding for the people. This devotion earned him a unique title among believers and non-believers alike, the Just and Oblias, the latter a term that apparently meant protection of the people. He was seen as a righteous man whose prayers shielded Jerusalem itself. These accounts must be handled carefully. Hegesippus wrote more than a century after James's death, and the details may have been embellished or idealized over time. But the core of the tradition, that James was known for extraordinary piety, finds support in the biblical text. Paul calls him a pillar. The Jerusalem Council deferred to his judgment. The early believers clearly held him in the highest regard. What drove this kind of devotion? Perhaps it was the memory of his earlier doubt. James had not believed during Jesus' ministry. He had stood among the skeptics. Then the resurrected Jesus appeared to him, transforming everything. That encounter may have instilled in James a deep sense of gratitude and purpose. He had been given a second chance, brought from unbelief to faith by grace. His response was total dedication. Or perhaps it was simply his nature. Some people are drawn to quiet devotion, to lives of prayer and simplicity. James may have found his calling not in traveling the world like Paul or performing bold miracles like Peter, but in maintaining a steady, righteous presence in Jerusalem. He was the anchor, the constant, the one who could always be counted on to pray, to fast, to live in a way that honored God. His lifestyle also served a strategic purpose. The early believers in Jerusalem lived among a Jewish population that was skeptical at best of their claims about Jesus. Many saw them as a troublesome sect, a group who had followed a failed Messiah and refused to release their delusions. But James's reputation for righteousness cut through that skepticism. Even those who did not believe in Jesus respected James. This respect gave the church in Jerusalem the space to exist and grow. The authorities might have moved more aggressively against the believers if not for the presence of leaders like James, whose personal holiness could not be denied. He was a bridge, someone who maintained deep roots in Jewish tradition while leading a movement that was pushing beyond it. James's devotion also modeled something important for the believers under his care. He taught that faith produces works, and he lived that teaching out. His prayer life was work, his fasting was work, his simplicity and self-denial were work. He demonstrated that following Jesus was not just about correct beliefs, but about a transformed life, a life oriented entirely toward God. The title James the Just was not self-applied. It was given to him by others, a recognition of his character. In a world where titles often reflected power or wealth, James's title reflected righteousness. He was known not for what he owned or controlled, but for who he was. Early Christians, looking for examples of holy living, would have pointed to James. Parents teaching their children about faith would have told stories of his devotion. Believers facing trials would have drawn strength from his example of perseverance in prayer. He was more than a leader. He was a living embodiment of the faith he proclaimed. The image of James kneeling in the temple, his knees worn from constant prayer, captures something essential about his character. He was not distant or aloof. He was present, faithful, devoted. He carried the concerns of the community before God. He interceded for the people, standing in the gap as a righteous man whose prayers carried weight. This aspect of James's life also highlights a tension within early Christianity. The movement was spreading, changing, adapting to new contexts. Paul was pushing into Gentile territory, establishing churches that looked very different from the Jewish believers in Jerusalem. But James remained rooted. He stayed in the temple. He maintained the traditions. He lived as a devout Jew who happened to believe that Jesus was the Messiah. This was not rigidity or a refusal to adapt. It was faithfulness to his calling. Someone needed to maintain that connection to the Jewish roots of the faith. Someone needed to show that following Jesus did not mean abandoning the law and the prophets. James was that someone. His piety also made his eventual martyrdom all the more tragic and powerful. When he was finally taken from the people, it was not just a leader who died. It was a righteous man, a man of prayer, someone whose life had been a testimony to devotion. His death would send shockwaves through Jerusalem, because everyone, believer and non-believer alike, recognized that an innocent man, a just man, had been taken. But that moment was still to come. For now, James continued his work. He prayed in the temple. He led the church. He lived simply and devoted himself entirely to the service of God and the people he loved. The man of prayer and piety, the just one, the brother of the Lord, stood as a pillar in Jerusalem, a constant presence in a rapidly changing world. The bridge between worlds. James occupied a unique and precarious position in the early church. He was not simply a leader, he was a bridge between two worlds that were rapidly drifting apart. On one side stood the Jewish believers in Jerusalem and Judea, people who viewed their faith in Jesus as the fulfillment of Jewish prophecy and who continued to observe the law of Moses. On the other side stood the growing number of Gentile believers scattered across the Roman world, who were coming to faith without first becoming Jewish. These two groups could easily have broken apart. Their customs were different, their histories were different, their understanding of what it meant to follow Jesus was, in many ways, different. But James held the center. He was respected by both sides, trusted by both sides, and therefore able to keep them connected, even as tensions grew. His relationship with Paul illustrates this dynamic. Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles, the one pushing the boundaries, the one arguing that Gentile believers did not need to be circumcised or to follow the dietary laws. His theology emphasized freedom from the law, salvation by faith alone, and the breaking down of barriers between Jew and Gentile. This message was radical. It threatened to overturn centuries of Jewish identity and practice, yet Paul respected James. In his letter to the Galatians, Paul describes traveling to Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion, specifically to visit Peter. But he also mentions meeting James, the Lord's brother. Later, 14 years after his conversion, Paul returned to Jerusalem with Barnabas and Titus. He met privately with James, Peter, and John, presenting the gospel he preached among the Gentiles. These leaders gave him the right hand of fellowship, affirming his ministry. James, Peter, and John asked only that Paul remember the poor, something Paul was eager to do. But the relationship was not without strain. In that same letter to the Galatians, Paul describes a confrontation in Antioch. Peter had been eating with Gentile believers, fully participating in table fellowship. But when certain men came from James, Peter withdrew and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. Paul confronted Peter publicly, accusing him of hypocrisy. The phrase, "certain men came from James," has sparked much debate. Did James actually send them? Did they truly represent his views, or were they simply from Jerusalem, claiming his authority without his blessing? Paul does not say directly, but the incident reveals the complexity of James's position. His name carried such weight that people invoked it to justify their actions. His leadership of the Jerusalem church meant that his views, or even his perceived views, influenced believers far beyond Judea. James walked a careful line. He maintained his own observance of the law. He lived as a devout Jew. He worshipped in the temple. He followed the customs of his ancestors. This was not merely a matter of personal preference. It was strategic. The believers in Jerusalem were surrounded by thousands of Jews who were zealous for the law. If the church appeared to be abandoning Jewish identity, the backlash would be severe. James's faithfulness to the law helped protect the community. But James also recognized that Gentile believers were different. The Jerusalem Council proved that. He ruled that Gentiles did not need to be circumcised. He asked only that they abstain from a few practices that would allow fellowship with Jewish believers. This compromise allowed the church to expand while preserving unity. The tension inherent in this position cannot be overstated. James was trying to hold together a movement that was pulling in opposite directions. Jewish believers wanted to preserve their identity and practices. Gentile believers wanted freedom from requirements they viewed as unnecessary. Both groups looked to Jerusalem for guidance. Both groups looked to James. Later in Acts, this tension surfaces again. Paul returns to Jerusalem after his missionary journeys. James and the elders greet him warmly, but they quickly raise a concern. Thousands of Jews have believed, they say, and all of them are zealous for the law. But they have heard that Paul teaches Jews living among Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or follow Jewish customs. The accusation was partly true and partly false. Paul did not require Gentile believers to follow the law, but he did not forbid Jewish believers from doing so either. Still, the perception was damaging. So James and the elders proposed a solution. Paul should join 4 men who had taken a vow, undergo purification with them, and pay their expenses. This public act would demonstrate that Paul himself still lived in observance of the law. Paul agreed. He went to the temple with the men. This decision reveals something important about James's leadership style. He was not simply rigid or legalistic. He was practical. He understood that perception mattered. He knew that the Jewish believers needed reassurance that their traditions were not being cast aside. So he asked Paul to make a visible gesture of solidarity. This incident also shows the respect Paul had for James. Despite their theological differences, despite the tensions in Antioch, Paul listened to James's counsel. He recognized James's authority. He understood that James was trying to maintain unity in an impossible situation. James's role as a bridge extended beyond managing tensions. He also ensured that the Gentile mission was not severed from its Jewish roots. Christianity emerged from Judaism. Jesus was Jewish. The apostles were Jewish. The scriptures they used were Jewish. James made sure this heritage was not forgotten or dismissed in the rush to welcome Gentiles. At the same time, he made sure that Jewish believers did not become isolated or irrelevant. As the church grew increasingly Gentile, there was a risk that the Jewish believers would be marginalized. James's presence and authority kept the Jerusalem church central to the movement, at least for a time. His position required wisdom, patience, and extraordinary humility. He could have insisted that everyone follow his example. He could have demanded that Gentile believers adopt Jewish practices, or he could have abandoned the law entirely and embraced Paul's vision fully. Instead, he chose a harder path. He held the middle ground, allowing for diversity within unity. This was the work of a true leader. Not someone who imposed his will, but someone who listened, who understood different perspectives, who found ways to keep people together even when they disagreed. James was that leader. He was the bridge between worlds. But bridges are vulnerable. They span gaps, which means they are stretched from both sides. As the years passed, as the tensions between Jewish and Gentile Christianity grew, as the political situation in Judea became increasingly unstable, James's position would become more and more precarious. He was respected, even revered, but respect does not always translate into protection. The bridge between worlds would not stand forever, and when it fell, the loss would be felt across the entire early church. The martyrdom of the Just One. The year was 62 AD. Jerusalem was in turmoil. The Roman governor, Porcius Festus, had died in office. His successor, Lucius Albinus, had been appointed but had not yet arrived from Alexandria. This created a power vacuum, a brief window during which Roman oversight was absent. Into that gap stepped Ananus, the high priest. Ananus came from a powerful priestly family. He was the son of Annas the elder, who had served as high priest years before. His brother-in-law was Joseph Caiaphas, the high priest, who had presided over Jesus' trial. Ananus was connected, ambitious, and according to the Jewish historian Josephus, a member of the Sadducees, he was known for being bold and reckless. With no Roman governor in place to restrain him, Ananus saw an opportunity. He convened a council, a judicial assembly of judges. Then he brought charges against several individuals. The primary target was James, the brother of Jesus, the one called Christ. Along with James, others were accused, though Josephus does not name them. The charges, according to Josephus, were breaking the law. The trial was swift. The council found James and the others guilty. The sentence was stoning. Stoning was the traditional Jewish punishment for certain offenses, including blasphemy and the breaking of key commandments. It was carried out publicly, a communal act in which witnesses threw the first stones, followed by the crowd. The condemned person was typically taken outside the city, led to a high place, and cast down. Then stones were thrown until life ended. James was taken, the just one. The man of prayer, the brother of the Lord, faced his accusers and his executioners. Early Christian writers, drawing on traditions that circulated after his death, give more details than Josephus does. According to Hegesippus, the scribes and Pharisees brought James to the pinnacle of the temple and demanded that he denounce Jesus before the crowd gathered for Passover. James refused. Instead, he proclaimed Jesus as the Son of Man, seated at the right hand of power, who would come again on the clouds of heaven. This enraged his accusers. They threw him down from the height. James survived the fall, injured but alive. He fell to his knees and began to pray, asking God to forgive those who were doing this. Then the stoning began. Stones rained down. James continued to pray. One man, described as a fuller, someone who cleaned and processed cloth, took a club used for beating fabric and struck James on the head. The blow ended his life. This account from Hegesippus adds drama and detail. It portrays James as a martyr in the same mold as Stephen, the first Christian martyr, who also prayed for his executioners as they stoned him. Whether every detail is historically accurate is difficult to determine. But the core fact is confirmed by Josephus, a non-Christian historian with no reason to embellish Christian traditions. James was executed by stoning at the order of Ananus. Why did Ananus target James? Several factors may have contributed. James was a prominent leader of a growing movement. The believers in Jesus were becoming more visible, more organized. They challenged the religious establishment by claiming that Jesus was the Messiah, that he had risen from the dead, that the temple system was no longer the ultimate path to God. This was deeply threatening to the priestly class, especially the Sadducees, who rejected resurrection and maintained power through the temple. James's righteousness may also have made him a target. He was respected by many in Jerusalem, even those who did not follow Jesus. This popularity could be seen as a threat. If too many people looked to James for guidance, it might undermine the authority of the high priest and the Sanhedrin. The power vacuum created by the governor's death gave Ananus the freedom to act. He did not need Roman approval. He did not need to worry about political consequences, at least not immediately. He could move quickly, convene a trial, pass judgment, and carry out the sentence before anyone could intervene. But Ananus miscalculated. He thought he could eliminate James quietly and consolidate his own power. Instead, his actions sparked outrage. Josephus records what happened next. The most fair-minded people in Jerusalem, those who were strict in their observance of the law, were deeply offended by Ananus's actions. They believed he had violated legal procedures. According to Jewish law, the high priest could not convene a judicial council without the Roman governor's permission. Ananus had acted illegally, taking advantage of the power vacuum. These offended citizens sent word to King Agrippa. Others went to meet the new governor, Albinus, as he traveled from Alexandria. They informed him of Ananus's illegal actions. Albinus was furious. He sent a letter to Ananus, threatening him with punishment. King Agrippa, who had the authority to appoint and remove the high priest, removed Ananus from office. He had served only 3 months. The swift removal of Ananus was a kind of vindication. It showed that James's execution was recognized, even by non-believers, as unjust. The outrage was not limited to the Christian community. Prominent Jewish citizens, people who respected the law and proper procedure, saw Ananus's actions as a violation. James had been so respected, so righteous, that his death sparked a reaction across Jerusalem. For the believers, the loss was devastating. James had led them for decades. He had been the steady hand, the wise voice, the connection to Jesus through family and through that resurrection appearance. He had held together a diverse and sometimes fractious community. He had navigated impossible tensions. He had embodied righteousness. Now he was gone. The community mourned. They buried James, though the location of his burial has been lost to history. Traditions later emerged about where he was laid to rest, but none can be confirmed. What matters is that the believers honored him, remembered him, and recognized that an era had ended. James's martyrdom also carried symbolic weight. He was the first major leader of the Jerusalem church to be taken by violence. Stephen had been the first martyr, but he was a deacon, not an apostle or a leader. James was different. He was a pillar. His death signaled that the authorities were willing to strike at the very heart of the movement. It also foreshadowed what was to come. Within a few years, Jerusalem would be engulfed in rebellion against Rome. The war would be brutal. The temple would be destroyed. The city would be devastated. The Jerusalem church, already without its leader, would scatter. The center of Christianity would shift away from Jerusalem to other cities. Antioch, Ephesus, Rome. But in 62 AD, the believers did not yet know this. They only knew that James, the just one, the brother of the Lord, the man who had led them faithfully, was gone. He had been taken by men who could not tolerate his righteousness, who saw him as a threat, who used a moment of political chaos to strike. James died as he had lived, faithful, righteous, proclaiming Jesus even in the face of death. The skeptic of Nazareth had become the martyr of Jerusalem, and his blood, like the blood of all martyrs, would water the seeds of faith he had planted. The aftermath. A city in mourning. The stoning of James sent shockwaves through Jerusalem. News of his execution spread quickly through the narrow streets, into the markets, across the temple courts. The believers wept, but they were not the only ones. Something remarkable happened in the aftermath of James's death. The broader community responded with anger and grief. Josephus records that the most fair-minded citizens of Jerusalem were offended by what Ananus had done. These were not followers of Jesus. They were devout Jews who cared deeply about the law and about proper legal procedure. They saw Ananus's actions as a violation of both. The high priest had convened a judicial council without Roman permission. He had rushed to judgment. He had executed a man widely known for righteousness. This reaction reveals just how respected James really was. His reputation transcended the boundaries of the Christian community. Even those who did not believe Jesus was the Messiah recognized James as a just man. His piety, his devotion to prayer, his adherence to the law, his care for the poor. All of this had earned him a place of honor in the eyes of many Jerusalemites. The execution of such a man felt wrong, it felt unjust, and in a city already strained with social, political, and religious tension, it became a flashpoint. Several citizens took action. Some sent messages to King Agrippa II, who held the authority to appoint and remove the high priest. They informed him of Ananus's illegal convening of the council and urged him to intervene. Others went further. They traveled to meet Albinus, the incoming Roman governor, as he made his way from Alexandria. They presented their case directly, explaining that Ananus had violated Roman authority by acting during the power vacuum. Albinus responded with fury. He wrote to Ananus, threatening punishment for his unauthorized actions. The high priest had overstepped by convening a judicial council without the governor's consent. Ananus had challenged Roman authority itself. This was not just about James. It was about power, about who had the right to pass and execute death sentences in Judea. King Agrippa acted swiftly as well. He removed Ananus from the high priesthood. Ananus had served only 3 months. His brief tenure ended in disgrace because he had ordered the execution of James. The removal was a public rebuke, a clear message that what had been done to James was wrong. For the believers, this response brought a measure of vindication. Their leader had been taken unjustly, and even the secular authorities acknowledged it. James had not been executed because he was guilty of any real crime. He had been executed because Ananus saw an opportunity and seized it, driven by hostility toward the movement James led. But vindication could not bring James back. The community had lost its pillar. For decades, James had been the one they turned to for guidance. He had resolved disputes, offered wisdom, maintained connections with the broader Jewish community, and held the church together through crisis after crisis. His presence had been a constant. Now that constant was gone. The question facing the Jerusalem church was existential. Who would lead them now? Who could fill the void left by James the Just? According to later Christian historians, the community chose a man named Simeon, who was also a relative of Jesus. But Simeon would never have the stature of James. The era of James's leadership was over. Beyond the immediate loss, James's martyrdom carried ominous implications. If the authorities were willing to execute someone as respected as James, who else might they target? The believers understood that their position was precarious. They lived in a city where religious and political tensions were escalating. Roman rule was increasingly harsh. Jewish zealots were growing more militant. The social fabric was fraying. Some believers may have begun to wonder whether Jerusalem was still the right center for their movement. Paul had established thriving churches across Asia Minor, Macedonia, and Greece. The faith was spreading far beyond Judea. Perhaps the future lay elsewhere. Perhaps it was time to prepare for life without Jerusalem as the mother church. These fears would prove prescient. Within a few years, in 66 AD, open rebellion broke out against Rome. The Jewish War began, a catastrophic conflict that would end with the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. According to Christian tradition, the believers in Jerusalem fled before the final siege, escaping to Pella across the Jordan River. They followed warnings attributed to Jesus about the coming destruction. The Jerusalem church survived, but it would never again be the center of Christianity. But in the immediate aftermath of James's death, the focus was on mourning and regrouping. The believers gathered, prayed, and tried to make sense of the loss. They remembered James's words, his wisdom, his example. They recalled how he had lived, devoted to prayer and righteousness. They honored him as a martyr, someone who had died for his faith. The broader Jewish community's reaction to James's death also highlighted a tragic irony. Many in Jerusalem respected James, even as they rejected Jesus. They saw James as a righteous Jew who happened to hold unusual beliefs about his brother. They did not share his faith, but they recognized his character. His execution offended them not because they believed in Jesus, but because they believed in justice. This respect for James might have created opportunities for dialogue, for bridge building between the Christian community and the wider Jewish world. But Ananas's rash actions destroyed that possibility. Instead of conversation, there was conflict. Instead of respect, there was suspicion. The execution of James deepened the divide between believers and non-believers. For the Christian movement, James's martyrdom became part of a growing narrative of persecution. Jesus had been crucified, Stephen had been stoned, now James had been taken. The pattern was unmistakable. Following Jesus meant risking everything, but it also meant joining a tradition of faithful witnesses who had given their lives for the truth they proclaimed. The aftermath of James's death was a time of grief, uncertainty, and transition. A city mourned, a community reeled. Leaders were removed and replaced, but through it all, the faith persisted. The believers continued to meet, to pray, to proclaim the resurrection. James was gone, but the message he had lived and died for remained. The just one had fallen. But his legacy was only just beginning. The enduring legacy of James, the just. Centuries have passed since James fell in Jerusalem. The city where he led the church was destroyed, rebuilt, destroyed again, and transformed beyond recognition. The temple where he prayed no longer stands. The communities he guided scattered across the world. Yet James remains a figure of lasting significance, his influence echoing through Christian tradition and history. Early Christian writers revered him. Hegesippus, writing in the 2nd century, presented James as a model of righteousness. His accounts, though written long after James's death, preserved traditions that shaped how later generations understood this figure. James was not merely a leader, he was a saint, a martyr, a man whose holiness set him apart. The Gospel of Thomas, a Gnostic text from the 2nd century, reflects James's high status in some early Christian circles. In one saying, the disciples asked Jesus who would lead them after he was gone. Jesus replies, "Wherever you are to go to James the righteous, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being." This is not a canonical text, and its theology differs sharply from the New Testament. But its inclusion of this saying shows that James was remembered as a figure of supreme importance, someone specially designated to lead. The church in Jerusalem continued to honor James. According to Eusebius, a church historian of the 4th century, the site of James's martyrdom was marked and remembered. Pilgrims visited, stories were told. James became part of the sacred geography of the city. Various Christian traditions claim James as their own. In Eastern Orthodoxy, he is venerated as Saint James the Just, commemorated on October 23rd. The Divine Liturgy of Saint James, one of the oldest Christian liturgies, is attributed to him, though it was likely developed later by communities that saw themselves as continuing his legacy. In the Roman Catholic tradition, James is honored as the first bishop of Jerusalem, though the title bishop, as a formal office, developed later. James's role as leader of the Jerusalem church made him a natural figure to claim as the founding bishop. His feast day in the Catholic calendar falls on May 3rd. Protestant reformers held mixed views of James. Luther, as mentioned earlier, struggled with the Epistle of James because he felt it placed too much emphasis on works. But other reformers recognized James's importance as a witness to the resurrection and a leader of the early church. The epistle remained in the canon, continuing to challenge and instruct believers about practical faith. Beyond formal traditions, James's legacy lives on in the themes he championed. His insistence that faith must produce works continues to resonate. Believers across the centuries have wrestled with his question: can faith that does not produce works save? This is not an abstract theological puzzle. It is a practical challenge that forces self-examination. Am I living my faith or merely professing it? James's concern for the poor and oppressed has inspired movements for social justice within Christianity. His condemnation of the rich who exploit workers, his call to care for widows and orphans, his insistence that true religion involves action, all of this speaks to believers who see faith as inseparable from justice. His role as a bridge between Jewish and Gentile Christianity also carries lessons. James held together a diverse community by listening, by finding common ground, by making space for different expressions of faith. In an era when Christianity is fragmented into countless denominations, James's example of unity amid diversity remains relevant. James's journey from skeptic to believer offers hope. He did not begin as a follower. He doubted, he questioned, he stayed away. Yet when confronted with the resurrected Jesus, he believed. His transformation shows that faith can emerge even out of deep skepticism. No one is too far gone, no doubt is too strong. His martyrdom stands as a testament to costly faith. James did not die during a dramatic missionary journey to a foreign land. He died in his own city, among his own people, because he would not stop proclaiming Jesus. His death reminds believers that faithfulness sometimes requires everything. The historical James, the man who lived and led in first-century Jerusalem, can be difficult to fully recover. The sources are limited. The New Testament mentions him but does not provide a complete biography. Josephus confirms his execution but offers little else. Early Christian traditions add details, but they were written long after the events and may reflect later theological concerns as much as historical memory. Yet through these fragments, a portrait emerges. James was a man of deep piety, devoted to prayer and righteous living. He was a wise leader, capable of making difficult decisions that held communities together. He was respected across social and religious boundaries, known even among non-believers as the Just. He was a bridge connecting the roots of Christianity with its expanding Gentile mission. He was a martyr, taken unjustly but vindicated by the outrage his death provoked. Most importantly, James was transformed. The skeptic became a witness. The doubter became a pillar. The brother who could not believe became the leader who guided the early church through its most critical years. That transformation, more than any title or achievement, defines his legacy. Today, when believers read the Epistle of James, they hear his voice across the centuries. When they struggle with the relationship between faith and works, they engage with questions he raised. When they seek to bridge divides in their communities, they follow his example. When they face persecution for their beliefs, they remember his courage. James, the just, the brother of Jesus, the pillar of Jerusalem, the martyr who gave his life rather than deny his faith, his story is woven into the very fabric of Christianity. He stands as a reminder that God can use anyone, even a skeptical brother. That righteousness matters. That faith must be lived, not just proclaimed. that leadership requires wisdom, humility, and the willingness to hold the center even when pulled from all sides. His legacy endures because the questions he wrestled with remain. How do we live out our faith? How do we maintain unity amid diversity? How do we stand for truth when it costs us everything? James answered these questions with his life, and his answers continue to challenge and inspire all who follow the brother he once doubted but came to proclaim as Lord.